Flow, one of the leading AI companies, and you're gonna blend MLOps with governance, and you're the CTO. So I'm really looking forward to what you're gonna say. Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to tell you a bit more about some of the recent things and very recent things we have actually been working on. Maybe to give you a bit of background, we are a Swiss company working more than a decade on the topics of safety, robustness, kind of how do we understand how these complex models work, how do we understand where they fail, and how can we actually make them improve. And this has become even more and more important now, given how powerful these systems become. And where there is power, in this case, comes a lot of big and urgent AI problems that have been really at the core of like really societal-wide discussions about how do we address some of these challenges in terms of privacy, security, robustness, discrimination, fairness, and so on. And more than often, we kind of learn about this from the news articles, which is really not the way to go about this. And as a result, this has really become the number one trend and concern all across different topics. It has resulted in a lot of attention from the governments and legislation, as we have seen both in US, Europe, and other parts of the world. I think what Charlotte said earlier today really kind of resonated with me. In many of these efforts, it's not only about being passive and coming up with like you should do this and this and this, but we need to be also proactive and kind of recognizing where the problems are and kind of step in because this is important. And this is all good. This is kind of what has been already been driven for the last 1 or 2 years. Where does the gap come in? The main gap comes in where people actually try to implement something in practice. So essentially what happens, if you look now, we have regulations, we have best practices, we have guidelines, but there really are no tools that allow you to implement it in practice. And why is this the case? Well, because this is a process. We are kind of building what this is supposed to be, and this is where kind of this gap appeared. And it's a problem because as the vendors, companies, and governments try to implement these things, they all independently have to go and figure out how am I actually supposed to be doing this. So we have all these people in parallel reading all the regulations and trying to come up with, okay, what am I supposed to do tomorrow if I actually want to implement any of these things? And kind of very concretely, if you look at the governance layer, this is what is happening on top. So you have regulations, you have legislations, you have AI risk and governance platforms or teams trying to, first of all, understand what's inside. And for those of you who actually try to read some of those, these are huge documents. This is 500 pages without like all the appendices and like additional documents that are coming in, that someone needs to read and understand and come up with, in this case, set of policies and evidence. And this is what's happening today. And there are what the AI risk managers, CEOs, CROs are trying to implement. And it actually becomes a checklist. It becomes a checklist. This is what the regulation says. This is, I should have a data that is not biased. I should have a data that is representative. Da, da, da. And I need to have someone who is going to provide the necessary evidence. And then there are systems where the evidence you can put in. And these are great systems, there is nothing wrong with it, but it's essentially an exercise in documenting things, which is good, we need this. But this is where the gap comes in, because on one hand, we have to come up with all this documentation, but on the other hand, we have all the systems down, which are part of the MLOps pipeline, that are part of what are the systems that are actually being deployed, both in terms of the data that have and in terms of the models, that have to be driving ultimately the evidence that we have on front. And why is this important? Well, because the part below is extremely dynamic. Like if I go and look at the bias of my system today, and I go to sleep and I wake up tomorrow, the data has changed. The world has changed. Like I have different subgroups, I have different models that I need to deploy, and I cannot be doing this every single day all over again. I need to have something that really automates these two and kind of bridges them together. So this is really the gap that we have right now, and this is the gap that we will try to fill in. And this is something that we all need to work together because we are looking at it from the technical perspective, but there are also other perspectives whether it's legal, whether it's ethical, and so on. So this is really what we've been trying to kind of add here as a driving force. How do we kind of connect these two worlds? So what we did concretely is come up with a framework where you start with kind of high-level legislation, could be UA Act, could be ISO standards, could be internal risk compliance documents and requirements. And we split it in three high-level layers. So the first one is a set of technical principles. And these are high-level principles that are shared across different regulations. So as we heard, you want the systems to be fair, you want the system not to be biased, you want the system to be robust. So these are the principles all models should adhere to. Then you can take the principles and you can kind of go one level deeper to translate them to technical requirements. And you can go even one more layer deeper that says, okay, now that I have these technical requirements, what is the concrete thing, what are the concrete benchmarks that I would go and actually check them. And this is a framework. Naturally, this is not fixed, it is updated. This is going to be a foundation for kind of going forward. And also, Alex mentioned that is Switzerland at the forefront of AI. I think we are very honored that we were actually selected by the Swiss government to be the company who is leading this effort to try to, from the technical point of view, standardize this process and come up with this kind of reusable set of techniques, principles, and benchmarks that can be used both by the industry and regulators to kind of reason about these systems. So this is where we are now, and I would like to tell you two very concrete projects that we did in this space. One is in the space of large language models and GPI systems. It's called Comply, and it's an open source framework that literally has the part on the left. So it takes, in this particular case, UA Act, it translates them into the principles, it translates it to the technical requirements and the benchmarks, and it also provides an open source tool to actually run it on whether the model is private or the model is public. And I will say a bit more here, kind of what is the tool, how did we use it, we actually did evaluate it on all the major kind of systems that already exist to kind of analyze where do they already work well, and where maybe there are some gaps that should be addressed in the future. And the second one is, again, following the same set of principles, and this is what makes it a unified framework, another use case on the tabular data. So this is maybe not so fancy these days because it doesn't have a language model, but it's a standard application of kind of AI-first system. In this case, this is a system that is actually having to do with kind of, you have used cars, you want to estimate the value of what you're selling, and this is now done by AI to be essentially competitive in the market and predict what the price is going to be in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. But because this is now a business that is built on AI, if that model is giving the wrong price estimates, you are going to have a huge risk. I mean, you already have a huge risk, you are going to have a huge loss as whoever is financing this, which in this case was a Migros bank. So how do we go essentially about this process? It's exactly the same as I mentioned. So it's something that has to bridge the risk and governance part at the top. So essentially you start with the regulations, you end up with some sort of report that is readable by kind of business people, regulators, CROs, CTOs, and you have to have the MLOps part down below. So what were the four main challenges when we're actually trying to do this? So the first one, you have to go deep. Again, you have to go technical deep. When people talk about what does it mean to be fair, what does it mean to be representative, you have to not only have a way to measure it, but you have to be reasoning about it. Okay, if someone gives me this explanation, is it really the right explanation? If I try to follow what the explanation is telling me, is the system going to behave in the way I expect? Because if I don't do this step, the explanation has essentially zero value, right? So you have to really connect these things. The same thing about, is there a data bias? Is there a data leakage? Well, how do you even answer these questions? That's one part. The second part, there is currently another gap, which is because the regulations are new, that are not complete. So if you want to again implement them in the practice, and ultimately the good thing is in all the engagements we have, people really do care about making these models better and making these systems work. Which means The regulations in many ways is for people who, I call it lazy. So these are lazy people that just want to follow the rules that someone else sets for them. But luckily for us, many people want to do the right thing, and that means there are things that are just missing, and we have to figure them out together. The third one, it is technically challenging, as I mentioned. It's not only about reporting numbers and saying, I believe this is an explanation, it's about following through and seeing the implications. And if you do this, the nice thing is this actually becomes actionable. It becomes very clear steps what you can do to improve the system in the end. And the last challenge here is you have to take all this technical work that you did and you have to lift it up, right? Like, how do I take all these concrete numbers of 63% of samples have some anomaly score above 0.1 to something that actually can be interpreted and applied? In the similar way, another example, if you talk about bias, the main difference here could, for example, be what are even the groups that we should consider for bias and fairness? Is this fixed and set up up front, or is the process more about let's try to search what are the groups? We don't know what they are up front, but we can search for them and we can kind of lift it up and report as a result. So this is on the type of data. Now if we go back to the language models, this is actually how the tool looks like. So if you're interested, please visit the website. As I mentioned, it's free, it's open source. We are adding models as we speak, and it really has these two components. So on one hand is the technical interpretation. So you can literally see it here. On the left, there is a principle of technical robustness and safety. This translates to technical requirements, and this translates to concrete benchmarks that can be executed and run. You can look at what are the examples, what does this benchmark actually mean, why are we kind of included it here in this process, and you can then run it on publicly available models or even private models to try to see where they stack. And the goal is not to really say you don't work here or you don't work here, and I don't know, ChatGPT is not good. That's not the goal. The goal is really to understand where these models work well. Most of these models are aligned with kind of the business goals. They're not aligned, unfortunately, with some of the goals that are outlined in the regulation about privacy, security, and so on. And this is, again, what you can just highlight here. And if you can start training them in a way that they're aligned, you will be kind of naturally becoming better in these benchmarks. And this is actually what we see. So if you just look at the evolution of the systems, even though they were not aligned, you can see a clear improvement. And if this becomes aligned, that's even better. So with this, if you have any more questions, happy to discuss afterwards. Please, if this is interesting, do reach out or just do check out the project. Again, it's open, it's free, so hopefully this is going to be very helpful for everyone.
Thank you very much, Pavol. I think that regulation is the first big task. Now the EU has done